War. Dawn broke over the silver sea, tipping the looming gate towers of Troy with sunlight. The sharp-eyed individuals could see women on the walls, looking out over the plains for signs of husbands, sons, and lovers. The Trojan warriors were still in the shadows as the sun glinted on the high vaulting prows of the Greek fleet, passed over the eyes painted on them in yellow, red, and black, and touched the spears upright in the sand. The Greeks were ready, like hounds about to be unleashed. Agamemnon stood before them, eager for battle, his red-crested helmet sparkling in the yellow morning light. His breastplate and the strips of dark blue enamel, gold and bronze, 3 snakes coiling up to the neck. Gold-studded studs glittered on his swords, and the Gorgon-faced embossing on his shield reflected the light in the dazzling lines into the eager faces of the men and up into the distant sky, where Hera and Athena saluted. The Greek warriors awaited their leader's order. They waited and waited. Beyond the Greeks' ditch, the Trojans fell in under the captains. The young and glorious Aeneas, Angenor, and Polydamas gathered around the great Hector. He walked into the thick of the army, encouraging his warriors. They would burn the Greek fleet where it stood and slaughter the Greek without mercy. It was about to begin. Agamemnon looked across his armies, and Nestor lifted his spear in salute. Odysseus lifted his sword. Diomedes and Ajax waited, straining for the word, so that they might be the first into battle. Agamemnon raised his spear and roared, "War!" The wild warriors poured over the ditch like roaring spring tide. They had no distance to charge before they were in the thick of it all. Through the morning and into the midday heat, the battle raged. It was savage, unyielding, violent work. On the beach, Achilles heard the battle, but he turned away and struck another chord on his silver lyre. Chariots thundered across the open spaces, horses were crippled or driven crazy by the noise and blood. Hector and some of the other fighters left their chariots to fight on foot, hand to hand, blade to blade. Blood soaked the sand beneath their feet, bodies were trampled or thrown aside, and the armor was stripped from them. Arms and legs grew wounds like flowers. Shoulders were smashed, faces were opened by slicing swords or crunching spears. This was war. Agamemnon did his share of slaughter, sent looted armor back to his chariot, and then sought more Trojan heroes to send to the never-ending darkness. Greeks and Trojans fell like corn under the scythe. Yet on they came. For every man that died, another stepped into his place. Zeus looked down from where he sat on Mount Ida and saw Troy and the Greek ships and the shimmering wave of men in bronze and blood pouring around the feet of the warriors at their work. Hector rallied his men and sent his share of Greeks to eternal darkness. This was war. 2 brothers begged Agamemnon for mercy, but he struck Perseander on the breast with his spear and flung him from his chariot. Hippolochus leaned down to defend his brother. Agamemnon slashed his head and arms from his body and moved on. This was war. Empty chariots drawn by fear-crazed horses raced in deadly circles among the fighting men. The Greeks swept eagerly over the plain toward the city walls. Agamemnon led his men to the city gates. Zeus, seeing this, called for Iris, his messenger. "Tell Hector that when he sees Agamemnon taken away from the battlefield in his chariot, that it is the time to counteract. I, Zeus, will give him the strength to take his men as far as the Greek ships, and then the sun will set." Hector, encouraged, urged his men to stand and hold the Greeks back. Agamemnon charged at the Trojans. He found himself confronted by Iphidamas in Thrace. Iphidamas lunged forward and thrust his spear under the high king's cuirass. He leaned his weight on the shaft, but he couldn't slice through the belt. Agamemnon pulled both the shaft and the man toward him, dragged the spear from his hand, and stabbed downward. Iphidamas fell, pinned by his throat, and went into endless darkness. Agamemnon was pulling the armor off the body when Coon, the dead man's brother, struck. His spear had pierced the high king's forearm. As Coon tried to pull Iphidamas away, Agamemnon struck upward and killed him. Then, even as his arm poured blood, he took the armor off both men and looked for his chariot. The charioteer came close enough for Agamemnon to hurl himself into it and be taken from the battle to the surgeons behind the lines. Hector, remembering Zeus's words, ordered his men to fight harder now that the Greek high king was gone. The Trojans came on, snarling like hounds. The Greeks, like wild boars, bloody and hunched in the dark forest, were forced to retreat. Hector came on, cutting into the ranks. The Greeks turned to run, and the Trojans fell on them in waves. Diomedes was wounded and taken behind the Greek lines, and even Machaon, the great healer, was wounded by an arrow fired by Paris. Machaon, friend of Achilles, was hurried off in Nestor's chariot to be treated. He was too valuable as a healer for the Greeks to lose. Odysseus fought on like the lion he was. Using his spear and both his sword and chopper, he took down men like woodsman cuts down saplings. Ennomus and Chersimandius both fell and clutched the ground. Chaperas, another Trojan, shut his eyes on the day. Socos bragged that he would kill Odysseus and wounded him with a hurtling spear. Odysseus speared Socos between the shoulders. Its point came out through the Trojan's chest. As Odysseus, standing on the back of the dead man, pulled out his spear, he too was bleeding from his wound. "Help me!" he cried to his friends. "Cover me! Help!" Trojans went in for the kill, but Ajax and Menelaus went to Odysseus' aid and covered the old fox. When the Trojans saw who was protecting him, they scattered to seek out easier prey. Leaning against Menelaus, Odysseus was helping him in his chariot and driven away to be treated. On the other wing, the Trojans were being forced back until Hector hurried to join them in the thick of the fight. Trojans and Greeks were trampling on corpses. Chariot wheels and axles were sprayed with blood thrown up by the iron-grooved tires. Hector saw Ajax defending the wounded Odysseus, but avoided him. Ajax, looking up from battle, saw he was heavily outnumbered and slowly retreated, constantly checking for danger, turning at bay sometimes to give himself and his men time to reach the Greek defenses. Eurypylus, king of Kos, seeing Ajax in danger, released his javelin and struck the Trojan who was about to attack mighty Ajax. Even as the javelin flew, Paris bent his bow and hit Eurypylus with an arrow. Eurypylus took cover with his men, and the arrow still sticking out of his thigh. Behind the lines, Nestor's chariot raced toward the ships and the huts of the Greeks carrying wounded men, including the healer Machaon. It passed the ships from which Achilles was watching the desperate battle. He looked down and saw his bleeding friend pass by in a chariot of wounded. Machaon was laid down gently, and his wound was treated by his own instruction. Suddenly, at the door of the hut, Patroclus, Achilles' favorite, appeared. Nestor looked around at him irritably. "What do you want with us?" he asked. "We're busy here. I have seen how badly Machaon has been wounded. Achilles wants to know. I must hurry, for Achilles is an impatient man. I don't understand why he's concerned with a single casualty when the entire army is suffering. Diomedes, Odysseus, and Agamemnon are all wounded, and Phyleus still has an arrow in his thigh. Achilles has a strange way of showing his concern. Is he waiting for all of our ships are in flames, and we are butchered down to a single man? I wish I was still young, sir. I'd show Achilles the meanings of courage." And the old man turned away from Patroclus, adding, "If you want to help persuade your master to let you go in the battle in his armor with the hordes he brought instead of letting them play games on the beach, you'd bring fresh blood to the fight, and we might push the Trojans back." "I will try," said Patroclus. He ran out of the hut along the beach. On his way he passed Odysseus' ships. Sitting there with Eurypylus, the arrow struck deep in his thigh. Moved by his bravery, Patroclus knelt on the sand beside the sweating man and asked, "Is there any hope of us holding back Hector, or will he be destroyed where we stand?" Eurypylus shook his head. "All of us heroes are wounded, and the enemy grows stronger. There is no hope." Patroclus sighed and got up to go. "Before you go, and tell your master Achilles that he could turn the day, help me. Cut out this arrow, wash the wound, and see me safe on my ship. I know you can heal me, for you've learned from the art of Achilles, who learned from Cheiron and the centaur." Patroclus took the sharp knife, gave Eurypylus a sword hilt to bite on, and then cut into his flesh and took the 3-barbed arrow out of his thigh. Above them on the plain, noise of the battle roared on.